Oberstfreiter Klaus Richter had laughed when he first saw the American rifle through his binoculars that frostbitten morning in the Ardennes forest, December 1944, its odd protruding clip and bulky receiver looking more like something a farmer might use to hunt rabbits than a proper military weapon. Nothing like the elegant lines of his Karabiner 98K with its smooth bolt action and 5-round internal magazine that had served the Wehrmacht faithfully across 3 continents. And he'd turned to his foxhole companion, the young Bavarian Private Werner Schmidt, who still had dirt from his family's potato farm under his fingernails, and said with the casual confidence of a veteran who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk that the Americans were sending boys into battle with toys, that their industrial wealth had made them soft and stupid, that they built everything for comfort rather than effectiveness, just like their tanks that were tall enough to hit from a kilometer away and their tracks that announced their position from 2 kilometers. But then the forest erupted with a sound Klaus had never heard before in 3 years of warfare. Not the methodical crack 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 of aimed bolt-action fire that he knew like his own heartbeat, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. 8 rounds in 3 seconds, reload, 8 more rounds in 3 seconds, and the oak tree that had protected his position for 2 days exploded in a shower of bark and splinters as American semi-automatic fire, each shot as powerful as his Mauser but coming 3 times as fast, turned the Wehrmacht's carefully prepared defensive positions into a killing ground where the old rules of engagement, the careful rhythm of fire and maneuver that had been drilled into soldiers since the days of bolt-action Gur 98s in the Great War, suddenly meant nothing at all. And Klaus Richter, who had dismissed the M1 Garand as an American indulgence, realized in the terrifying clarity that comes with impending death that he had been catastrophically, perhaps fatally, wrong. The morning had started like any other in that miserable winter campaign. Klaus had awoken in his foxhole at 0500 hours, his breath creating clouds of vapor that hung in the still air like ghosts. His hands, wrapped in wool gloves with the fingers cut off so he could still operate his rifle, were nearly numb despite the layers. Werner, the farm boy, was already awake, staring eastward toward the German lines with the homesick expression that never quite left his face. "Coffee's ready?" Werner whispered, gesturing to a battered tin cup balanced precariously on a small spirit stove they'd liberated from a Belgian farmhouse. The liquid inside was barely coffee, mostly roasted grain and chicory, but it was hot, and in December 1944 in the Ardennes, hot was all that mattered. Klaus took the cup gratefully, wrapping both hands around it. "Any movement?" "Nothing yet. Quiet as a graveyard." Werner paused, then added with the gallows humor that kept soldiers sane. "Which is what we'll turn it into if those Amos try pushing through here." Klaus nodded, taking a careful sip of the bitter brew. Their position was good, excellent, really. They occupied a slight rise in the forest, with clear fields of fire down 2 approaches. Behind them, another 200 meters back, was the main defensive line with MG-42 machine gun positions and a company of infantry. Klaus and Werner were part of the forward observation post, their job to provide early warning and slow down any American advance. The Karabiner 98K leaning against the frozen earth beside Klaus was a weapon he knew intimately. He'd carried variations of it since 1941, and his father had carried its predecessor in the trenches of France in 1916. It was a bolt-action rifle, meaning after each shot the shooter had to manually work the bolt. Pull it up, pull it back to eject the spent cartridge, push it forward to chamber a new round, and push it down to lock. In skilled hands, a soldier could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute, maybe 20 if rushed and accuracy didn't matter. The internal magazine held 5 rounds, loaded from the top via a stripper clip. It was, by any objective measure, an excellent rifle. Accurate to 800 meters, reliable in the worst conditions, powerful enough to stop a man at extreme range. The 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser round it fired had been battle-tested for nearly half a century. Klaus had killed his first Russian with a shot at 620 meters outside Stalingrad. The rifle had never failed him, which was why he felt such contempt when, as the weak winter sun began to paint the eastern sky gray, he spotted the American patrol. There were 6 of them, moving with the careful caution of men in enemy territory. They were perhaps 400 meters away, barely visible through the skeletal winter trees. Klaus brought up his binoculars, the same Zeiss optics that had served him since Russia. The Americans were young, they all were young on both sides now, but what caught Klaus's attention was their rifles. Even at this distance, even in the dim morning light, the distinctive silhouette was unmistakable. The M1 Garand with its 8-round en-bloc clip protruding from the receiver, the gas tube running beneath the barrel, the bulky operating rod. "Take a look," Klaus whispered, passing the binoculars to Werner. "See their rifles? That's the famous Garand the Americans are so proud of." Werner squinted through the lenses. "Looks heavy and complicated." "It is both," Klaus agreed. He'd seen intelligence reports on the weapon, had even handled a captured example briefly after a skirmish in France back in August. The rifle was semi-automatic, pull the trigger, and the force of the fired cartridge automatically cycled the action, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. No need to work a bolt. In theory, this meant a much higher rate of fire. In theory. 8 rounds, Klaus continued, keeping his voice low. Fires as fast as you can pull the trigger. The Americans think it gives them an advantage. Does it? Werner asked, handing back the binoculars. Klaus smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. What good is rapid fire if you can't hit anything? War isn't won by spraying bullets, Werner. It's won by aimed shots from covered positions. Look at them, walking around like they're on a Sunday stroll. Discipline, training, marksmanship, these are what matter. Not fancy rifles that let you waste ammunition faster. It was a belief Klaus held deeply, a conviction forged in 3 years of combat. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe with bolt-action rifles. The Soviets had fought them to a standstill with bolt-action rifles. The British, the French, the Poles, everyone used bolt-action rifles. Semi-automatic weapons were a luxury, perhaps useful in specific circumstances, but not a fundamental game-changer. Should we engage? Werner asked, his hand moving toward his Kar 98K. Not yet. Let them come closer. At 400 meters, we'd get 1, maybe 2 before they scatter. I want them all. Klaus settled the binoculars more comfortably against his face. Patience, Werner. Patience is how you survive. The American patrol continued forward, using decent tactical spacing but following a somewhat predictable path along a fallen log that provided the easiest route through the dense undergrowth. Klaus tracked them, his mind calculating angles and distances. At 200 meters, he and Werner could each drop 2 or 3 before the survivors found cover. Clean, efficient, professional. The Americans disappeared briefly behind a thick stand of pines. Klaus lowered the binoculars and picked up his rifle, working the bolt to chamber around. The familiar mechanical action was comforting, each movement practiced 10,000 times until it was more instinct than thought. Klaus, Werner whispered urgently. There's more of them. Klaus brought the binoculars back up. Werner was right. The 6-man patrol had been the advance element. Behind them, perhaps 50 meters back, was a full platoon, 30, maybe 40 men. And they were moving with more purpose now, weapons ready, clearly expecting contact. Skice, Klaus muttered. This changed things. 2 men couldn't engage a full platoon in the open. They needed to fall back, warn the main line, let the MG-42s do their work. But before he could give the order to withdraw, the forest exploded. The sound came first, not from the Americans ahead but from their left flank. It was a sound Klaus had never heard before, a rapid hammering that was too fast for bolt-action rifles but too rhythmic and controlled to be machine gun fire. 8 shots in perhaps 3 seconds, then a peculiar metallic ping, then 8 more shots. The Wehrmacht squad that had been moving up to reinforce Klaus's position, 20 men he hadn't even known were there, were caught completely exposed in a small clearing 50 meters to his left. They'd been moving in standard infantry formation, spread out in a skirmish line, weapons ready but not expecting contact from that direction. The American fire cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Klaus watched in horror as German soldiers dropped, not one at a time the way they did in normal combat, but in groups 3 and 4 at once. The Americans, he could see them now, perhaps a dozen riflemen who'd been waiting in ambush, were firing as fast as they could pull their triggers. Each M1 Garand spitting out 8 rounds in the time it would take Klaus to fire 2, maybe 3 aimed shots with his Kar 98K. It wasn't the wild, inaccurate spray of machine gun fire. Each shot was aimed, deliberate, but they came so fast, so continuously, that it created an overwhelming volume of fire that made it impossible for the German soldiers to return effective fire. By the time a Wehrmacht soldier could work his bolt, chamber a new round, find a target, and aim, the Americans had already fired 4 more times. Klaus saw Unteroffizier Hartmann, a veteran sergeant who'd earned the Iron Cross at Kiev, try to organize a response. Hartmann dropped to one knee, brought his rifle up, fired, worked the bolt. Before he could acquire a new target, 2 American rounds hit him in the chest, the impact throwing him backward into the frozen mud. The German squad tried to scatter, to find cover, but the Americans adjusted their fire with devastating efficiency. Every time a Wehrmacht soldier paused to return fire, that critical moment when he had to stop moving and work his bolt, the Americans poured rounds into his position. It was methodical, professional, and utterly terrifying. In less than 90 seconds, it was over. The German squad was destroyed, dead, dying, or running blindly away from the killing ground. And the Americans were already moving, advancing through the positions they just cleared, their rifles ready, each man carrying that semi-automatic weapon that Klaus had so casually dismissed. "We need to go," Werner hissed, his voice high with barely controlled panic. "Now, Klaus. Now." But Klaus couldn't move. He was transfixed, his tactical mind racing through the implications of what he'd just witnessed. Everything he'd believed about infantry combat, everything he'd learned in 3 years of warfare, had just been rendered obsolete in 90 seconds. The advantage in infantry combat had always gone to the defender, to the soldier in cover who could take aimed shots at exposed attackers. The attacker had to move, had to expose himself, and while he was moving, he couldn't shoot effectively. The defender could pick him off at leisure. This fundamental truth had governed warfare since the invention of the rifle. But the M1 Garand changed that calculus. With a semi-automatic rifle, an American soldier could fire effectively while moving, could suppress a defender's position with rapid fire while his comrades maneuvered, could maintain a continuous volume of fire that made it suicidal for the defender to expose himself long enough to aim and shoot. The Americans had brought a firepower advantage to the individual infantryman that was, Klaus suddenly realized, equivalent to giving every soldier his own light machine gun. Except the M1 was more accurate than a machine gun, more reliable, easier to maintain, and every single American rifleman had one. "Klaus!" Werner grabbed his arm. "They're coming!" The American platoon was advancing now, moving through the forest in fire and maneuver tactics that were textbook perfect. One squad would provide covering fire, that devastating, continuous semi-automatic fire, while another squad advanced. Then they'd switch, leapfrogging forward, always keeping the Germans suppressed, never giving them a chance to establish effective return fire. Klaus finally moved, grabbing Werner's collar and pulling him back toward their secondary position. They crawled on their bellies through the frozen undergrowth, the sounds of American fire now coming from multiple directions. The Wehrmacht's main defensive line was engaging now, the distinctive buzzage sound of MG-42 machine guns cutting through the forest. They tumbled into a deeper fighting position, part of the main line, where a squad of German infantry was hastily preparing to meet the American advance. The squad leader, an older Feldwebel named Koch with a weathered face and the ribbon of the Eastern Front medal on his tunic, grabbed Klaus. "What happened to the observation post? Where's Hartmann's squad?" "Gone," Klaus gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Wiped out. The Americans. Their rifles, they fire so fast." Koch's expression hardened. "Pull yourself together, Obergefreiter. It's just another attack. We've stopped 100 of them." But Klaus shook his head. "No, this is different. You don't understand." An American squad appeared through the trees, perhaps 60 meters away. Koch's squad opened fire, the careful, aimed shots of trained Wehrmacht infantry. Klaus saw an American fall, then another. But before the German soldiers could work their bolts and chamber fresh rounds, the return fire came. It was like standing in front of a thunderstorm. 8 Americans with M1 Garands, each firing as fast as they could pull the trigger. 64 rounds in the first 10 seconds. The oak tree that formed the corner of their fighting position exploded under the impact, bark and with splinters flying like shrapnel. The log they'd piled for additional protection shattered. The frozen earth kicked up in small geysers where American bullets struck. One of Koch's men, A young private whose name Klaus didn't know tried to return fire. He exposed himself for perhaps 2 seconds to aim and shoot. 3 American rounds hit him almost simultaneously, chest, shoulder, neck. He was dead before he hit the ground. Another soldier, more experienced, tried to fire from cover, exposing only his head and shoulders. He got off 1 shot, worked his bolt. Before he could fire again, an American bullet struck the receiver of his Kar 98K with a metallic clang, wrenching the rifle from his hands and leaving him clutching a broken thumb. Koch was screaming orders, trying to organize a coherent defense, but his voice was almost lost in the continuous crack of American rifle fire. The MG-42 crew in the position to their right opened up, the machine gun's incredible rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, finally providing suppressing fire that made the Americans duck. But the advantage was temporary. The MG-42 ran through its belt in seconds and needed to reload. In that brief pause, the Americans advanced another 10 meters and found better cover. When the MG-42 opened up again, its fire was less effective, and now more American squads were arriving, their M1 Garands adding to the overwhelming volume of fire. Klaus realized with crystal clarity that they were going to die in this position. The Americans had effectively doubled or tripled their infantry firepower with the M1 Garand, and the Wehrmacht simply couldn't match it with bolt-action rifles. Every tactical advantage that had kept German infantry competitive despite being outnumbered was being negated by the Americans' ability to fire twice as fast, 3 times as fast, with the same accuracy. Fall back! Koch was screaming. Falling back to secondary positions. The squad began to retreat, moving in groups, some providing covering fire while others ran. But covering fire from bolt-action rifles was pitiful compared to what the Americans could produce. Klaus fired, worked his bolt, fired again. In the time it took him to fire those 2 shots, the American position he was shooting at had fired 16. Werner was beside him, his face white with terror but still functioning, still shooting. "I thought you said their rifles were toys," he shouted over the chaos. Klaus had no answer. He grabbed Werner and they ran, crouched low, toward the next fighting position. An American bullet cracked past Klaus's ear. So close he felt the supersonic shock wave. Another round hit his pack, punching through his spare uniform and mess kit but miraculously missing his body. They dove into the next position, a hasty trench that had been dug the previous day. 3 other German soldiers were already there, firing sporadically at the advancing Americans. One of them was Gefreiter Meller, a Rhinelander who'd trained with Klaus. "They're everywhere," Muller shouted. "Every time we slow them down, more appear." And it was true. The Americans were exploiting their firepower advantage to the maximum. Traditional infantry tactics dictated caution, careful advances, because an attacking force had to expose itself. But the M1 Garand allowed the Americans to attack with a level of aggression that would have been suicidal with bolt-action rifles. They could afford to move more boldly because any German soldier who tried to aim and shoot at them would be immediately suppressed by devastating return fire. It was a complete reversal of the normal advantage of defense over offense. Klaus fired until his rifle was empty, then fumbled for a stripper clip to reload. His hands were shaking from cold, from adrenaline, from the dawning realization that German infantry doctrine, the tactics and training that had made the Wehrmacht so effective, were based on assumptions that the M1 Garand had just shattered. An American squad reached a position just 30 meters away, and Klaus got his first clear look at the enemy. They were young, scared, dirty, just like every other soldier he'd fought. But they moved with confidence, with an aggressive momentum that Klaus had rarely seen in infantry combat. One American, a sergeant by his stripes, raised his M1 and fired 8 shots at the German position in perhaps 4 seconds. The rounds kicked up dirt along the trench lip, forcing everyone to duck. By the time Klaus raised his head to return fire, the American had reloaded, that distinctive ping of the en-bloc clip ejecting, and fired 8 more rounds. 16 shots in less than 10 seconds. Klaus would have needed 20 to 30 seconds to fire 16 aimed shots with his Kar 98K. "We can't hold," someone was screaming. "We need to pull back." But pulling back was becoming impossible. The Americans were moving too fast, their overwhelming firepower allowing them to close the distance quickly. The Wehrmacht's carefully prepared defensive positions were being overrun one after another, not through superior tactics or numbers, but through sheer, crushing firepower. The MG-42 position to their right went silent. Whether destroyed or retreating, Klaus couldn't tell. Without the machine gun's support, their section of the line was collapsing. American squads were flanking them, moving with practiced efficiency through the winter forest. Klaus made a decision. Werner Muller were pulling back. Now, leave everything but weapons and ammunition. They scrambled out of the trench and ran. Behind them, American rifle fire followed, rounds cracking through the bare branches overhead. Klaus's lungs burned. His legs felt like lead, but terror drove him forward. Werner was right beside him, and Muller was behind, covering their retreat with sporadic rifle fire that did almost nothing to slow the American advance. They ran for perhaps 300 meters, deep enough into the forest that the immediate sound of combat faded to a distant rumble. Finally, gasping, they collapsed behind a snow-covered fallen log. What happened? Muller demanded between ragged breaths. I've never seen Americans attack like that. They're usually so cautious. They're rifles, Klaus managed. The Garand. It gives them... He paused, struggling to articulate what he'd realized. It changes everything. They can fire as fast as they can pull the trigger. 8 rounds without reloading. It doubles, maybe triples their firepower compared to us. So what? Muller said, though his voice held less conviction than his words. We're better trained, better soldiers. Are we? Klaus asked bitterly. What good is training when the enemy can fire 3 times as many rounds in the same time? What good is marksmanship when we're suppressed so heavily we can't aim? What good is tactical skill when they can advance with an aggression we can't match because their firepower covers them? Werner was nodding slowly. On the farm, my father always said that having a better tool matters more than people think. A good plow beats a poor plow, even if the man behind it is strong. A sharp scythe beats a dull one, even in skilled hands. This isn't farming, boy, Muller snapped. Isn't it? Werner shot back, more anger in his voice than Klaus had ever heard. We're trying to harvest American lives with tools from the last century while they're using modern equipment. Klaus said it himself. We laugh at them, we call them soft, we say they rely on their wealth instead of skill. But what if wealth buys you M1 Garands, and M1 Garands win battles? The forest around them was eerily quiet now. The sound of combat had moved farther east, following the Wehrmacht's retreat. Somewhere in the distance, artillery was starting to fire, German guns trying to slow the American advance. Klaus checked his rifle, an automatic gesture born of years of practice. 5 rounds in the magazine. He had perhaps 30 more rounds in his pouches. Enough for a few minutes of combat, maybe less, against Americans with their semi-automatic rifles and seemingly endless ammunition. We need to reach the rally point, Klaus finally said. Reform with the company. Establish a new defensive line. But even as he said it, he knew it was only delaying the inevitable. The Americans would attack again with their M1 Garands, and the Wehrmacht would retreat again, and this pattern would continue until there was no more ground to retreat to. They started moving east, staying off the obvious paths. 3 exhausted soldiers in a beaten army. As they walked, Klaus's mind kept returning to that morning, to his casual dismissal of the American rifle. He'd laughed at it, called it a toy, assumed that German superiority in training and doctrine would overcome any material advantage. But warfare, Klaus was learning too late, was not about superior soldiers. It was about systems, tools, logistics. The Americans had built a system that equipped every single rifleman with a weapon that doubled his effectiveness. They'd industrialized warfare in a way the Wehrmacht, for all its vaunted tactical excellence, had never matched. The M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle. It was a symptom of a completely different approach to war. The Americans didn't try to create the perfect soldier through ruthless training and doctrine. They created adequate soldiers and gave them overwhelming material advantages. They didn't value martial excellence. They valued industrial production. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, Klaus Richter was discovering that the American way was winning. They reached the rally point near dusk, a collection of farm buildings that had been designated as the company assembly area. What remained of Klaus's company was already there, perhaps 60 men out of the 150 who'd held the line that morning. They were defeated, demoralized, and exhausted. Hauptmann Weber, the company commander, was organizing them into a defensive perimeter, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. When Klaus reported, Weber just nodded tiredly. "I know, Obergefreiter. I saw it too. They're rifles." Weber lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "High Command says we're getting new automatic weapons. The STG-44. Supposed to match the Americans." "Too few, too late," Klaus said quietly. Weber didn't argue. They both knew the truth. The war was lost. It had been lost at Stalingrad, lost at Kursk, lost in the skies over Germany where American bombers destroyed factories that could have produced better weapons. But here, in this forest, Klaus had seen exactly how it was being lost. One firefight at a time, American semi-automatic rifles destroying German bolt-action rifles, superior material overwhelming superior training. That night, huddled in a shell-damaged barn with Werner and a dozen other survivors, Klaus finally allowed himself to think the unthinkable. Germany was going to lose this war. Not because German soldiers were inferior, not because German tactics were flawed, but because the Americans had built a better system for killing. The M1 Garand was a symbol of that system, a weapon so effective that it changed the fundamental dynamics of infantry combat. In the hands of reasonably trained soldiers with adequate supplies, it was enough to overcome all of the Wehrmacht's advantages in doctrine, training, and battlefield experience. "Klaus," Werner whispered in the darkness, "do you think we'll survive?" Klaus thought about lying, about offering false hope. But Werner deserved better than that. "I don't know," Klaus said honestly. "But I know this, everything we were taught about warfare, everything the generals told us about German superiority, it was based on assumptions that are no longer true. The Americans changed the rules with that rifle. They made every infantryman twice as effective, and we have no answer for it. So we just give up? No." Klaus gripped his Kar 98K, feeling its familiar weight, its elegant simplicity, its obsolescence. "We fight. We do our duty. But we fight knowing that we're trying to win a modern war with outdated tools, and that's a battle we can't win." Outside, the winter wind howled through the Ardennes forest. Somewhere in the darkness, Americans were advancing, their M1 Garands ready, each rifle a mechanical force multiplier that had helped turn the tide of the war. And somewhere in Berlin, in comfortable offices far from the front lines, generals who had never faced the thunder of American semi-automatic fire were still making plans based on assumptions about German superiority that had died in a forest clearing in less than 90 seconds. Klaus Richter, who had laughed at the M1 Garand that morning, now understood that he'd been laughing at the future. A future where industrial might and practical engineering defeated martial tradition and tactical excellence. He'd been laughing at the weapon that would help destroy his army, his country, his world. He hadn't found it funny since.